In just 6 days during June 1967, Israel achieved one of the most decisive military victories of the 20th century, defeating the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria simultaneously. How did a small nation fighting on 3 separate fronts manage such a swift and overwhelming triumph, and why were the Arab states unable to mount an effective response in time? Nearly 2 decades after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Middle East was still defined by the unresolved tensions that followed the creation of the Jewish state. Palestinians living under Egyptian control in Gaza and under Jordanian administration in the West Bank continued to hope that a future armed conflict would eliminate Israel and give rise to a Palestinian homeland. Syria actively backed Palestinian militant groups, including Fatah, with the aim of destabilizing Israel through cross-border attacks. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, riding a wave of pan-Arab nationalism and emboldened by the perceived diplomatic victory Egypt had gained during the 1956 Suez Crisis, was positioning himself as the undisputed leader of the Arab world. Israel, for its part, had emerged from previous conflicts with a stronger military, but remained geographically hemmed in by hostile neighbors on nearly every side. The Arab states were far from unified. A failed pro-Nasser coup in Syria in 1961 had deepened the rift between Damascus and Cairo. Jordan's King Hussein was at open odds with Egypt over Palestinian policy, and had even survived an alleged Egyptian-backed assassination attempt in 1962. Yet despite their internal rivalries, opposition to Israel remained the one cause that brought Arab leaders together. Cross-border raids by Syrian forces and Palestinian fighters, particularly targeting Israeli communities near the Golan Heights, were frequent, often drawing Israeli military responses. Syria then used those reprisals to publicly criticize Egypt for its inaction. Following a major Israeli raid on the West Bank village of Samu in November 1966, Nasser's failure to respond drew sharp rebukes from Syria and Jordan, who accused him of abandoning the Arab cause. Tensions escalated again on April 7, 1967, when Syrian shelling of Israeli border towns triggered Israeli airstrikes. Israeli Mirage jets shot down 7 Syrian MiG-21s and overflew Damascus, a visible and humiliating demonstration of Israeli air dominance. The situation reached a tipping point in mid-May. On May 14th, the Soviet Union passed intelligence to Nasser, warning that Israel was preparing an imminent strike against Syria. The claim was false, a fact Soviet, Syrian, and Egyptian sources would confirm within days. But by then, events had moved beyond control. Nasser, unwilling to appear passive, ordered Egyptian forces into the Sinai Peninsula. On May 19th, the United Nations Emergency Force, which had kept watch on the Egyptian-Israeli border since 1956, withdrew at Nasser's demand. That same day, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol mobilized additional reserve units and dispatched hundreds of tanks southward. Nasser believed he could leverage the pressure on Israel to boost his regional standing without triggering an actual war. On May 21st, he announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a route Israel had forced open after 1956. As Egyptian troops paraded through Cairo toward the Sinai, Arab public opinion surged with anticipation, and state media stoked the mood with fiery broadcasts. But for Israel, the blockade represented an act of war. By June 4th, with Arab rhetoric growing louder and mobilization complete, the Israeli War Cabinet voted to strike first. The attack was scheduled for 7 a.m. on June 5th. On the eve of war, the Israeli Defense Forces numbered roughly 264,000 troops, including reservists, supported by around 1,000 tanks and 250 combat aircraft, with well-trained crews capable of rapid back-to-back sorties. Opposing them were substantial forces. Egypt had 100,000 troops and 950 tanks in the Sinai, backed by 282 aircraft. Syria fielded 75,000 soldiers and 300 tanks on the Golan Heights with 120 jets. Jordan deployed 55,000 troops, over 300 modern tanks, and 24 fighter aircraft. Israeli military planners had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of preemptive strike. The intelligence agency Mossad had placed operatives inside Arab military structures, including Wolfgang Lotz, a German-Israeli agent who embedded himself among senior Egyptian officers by posing as a former SS officer. Israeli intelligence had mapped the position of every Egyptian aircraft on the ground, along with the identities and voices of many pilots. Flight crews rehearsed their attack plans obsessively. They knew their targets and timetables before takeoff orders were even issued. At 7:30 a.m. on June 5th, nearly 200 Israeli jets lifted off in staggered waves from multiple bases, flying low over the Mediterranean to evade Egyptian radar. Coincidentally, Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries had received no firing orders that morning, because Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer was himself aboard an aircraft. Within an hour, Israeli strikes had obliterated most Egyptian air bases, cut communications lines between the Sinai and military headquarters, killed more than a third of Egypt's pilots, and destroyed the bulk of its combat aircraft, all while losing only 9 planes. Syrian and Jordanian airfields were struck shortly after, eliminating over half of Syria's air force and most of Jordan's. On the ground, Israeli armored columns drove deep into the Sinai with speed and coordination that Egyptian commanders could not match. Egyptian troops, surprised and already cut off from headquarters, found themselves outflanked on multiple axes simultaneously. In the north, Israeli forces bypassed Gaza to accelerate the push into Sinai. In the center, Major General Ariel Sharon's division punched through Egyptian defenses at Abu Aguila using combined armor, infantry, artillery, and helicopter-deployed paratroopers in a textbook assault. By nightfall, 2 Egyptian divisions had been shattered. To the east, King Hussein, despite Israeli hopes he might stay out, launched cross-border attacks. Israeli forces responded by driving into the West Bank and toward East Jerusalem. The battle for the city became one of the war's most intense engagements. On June 6, Israeli paratroopers fought a bitter overnight battle for Ammunition Hill against the entrenched 2nd Al-Husseini Battalion, suffering 31 dead before taking the position at dawn. Fighting in Jerusalem's alleyways was ferocious and sometimes descended into hand-to-hand combat. By June 7, as Jordanian reinforcements were cut to pieces by Israeli airstrikes and supplies ran dry, Jordanian soldiers quietly abandoned the old city. Israeli paratroopers entered the walled compound, reaching the western wall, a moment that became the defining image of the war for many Israelis. In Sinai, the Egyptian collapse accelerated. Israeli jets armed with napalm hit retreating columns on the roads to the Suez Canal, while armored units raced to seal the Mitla and Gidi passes. What had begun as a managed withdrawal disintegrated into chaos. 80% of Egypt's military hardware was lost, 700 tanks, 10,000 vehicles, and hundreds of artillery pieces. So many prisoners were taken that Israel simply disarmed them and sent them across the canal on foot. On June 8, Nasser accepted a UN ceasefire. Egypt's war was over. The final front was the Golan Heights. Syrian defensive positions were deeply entrenched in rocky, elevated terrain, protected by minefields, buried tanks, and artillery bunkers. But Syrian forces suffered from poor training, leadership gutted by political purges, and no meaningful air support. On June 9, Israel launched over 1,000 air sorties and a grinding ground assault. Syrian defenders fought back hard, inflicting heavy losses on Israeli tanks and engineering vehicles. Yet when Israeli infantry finally cleared the trenches, resistance crumbled. On June 10, a Syrian radio broadcast mistakenly announced that the town of Quneitra had already fallen, triggering a chaotic general retreat. Syrian commanders fled. Israeli troops entered Quneitra to find vehicles still running and radio equipment still broadcasting. Syria accepted a ceasefire hours later. The 6-day war ended with Israel triumphant on all 3 fronts. Several factors explained the outcome. Israel's opening airstrike was a complete surprise that instantly stripped the Arab coalition of air cover, allowing Israeli ground forces to operate freely across every theater. Egypt and Syria suffered from widespread corruption, undertrained conscripts, poorly supplied with food and ammunition, and commanders who either panicked or abandoned their men. Jordan's army was professional, but far too small to defend the West Bank alone. And Field Marshal Amr's disastrous decision to order a premature withdrawal exposed the Egyptian military to total destruction. The human cost was substantial. Israel lost 679 soldiers killed. Egypt suffered approximately 11,000 dead and 5,000 captured. Jordan around 6,000 dead and 500 captured. Syria roughly 1,000 dead and 600 captured. The political consequences proved just as consequential as the military ones. Israel tripled in territorial size overnight. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, who had hoped war would bring liberation, found themselves under Israeli military occupation instead. Over 240,000 Palestinians fled to Jordan and neighboring Arab states. In several Muslim-majority countries, waves of anti-Semitic violence erupted, resulting in the expulsion or flight of Jewish communities from Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere. Arab governments refused to recognize Israel or negotiate a formal peace, keeping the region primed for future conflict. For Israel, it was a moment of seemingly miraculous victory. For the Arab world, it became known simply as Al-Naqsa, the setback. Nearly 60 years later, its central unresolved consequence, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, remains one of the most contested issues in global politics.